Now that we have finished an overview of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel in outline form, we're free to move on to consider some literary observations. These are not intended at all to be exhaustive, but rather representative. An initial literary question that comes before us has to do with whether what appears to us as two books, 1st Samuel and 2nd Samuel, should be regarded as two separate books or as one with simply a convenient division. By examining the content located at the seam, that is, at the end of 1st Samuel and the beginning of 2nd Samuel, we can see that these are closely related. At the outset of the second book, 2nd Samuel, we find mention of two things: Saul's death and David's campaign against the Amalekites, which links that second book closely to the close of the previous book. So we should regard this as one running book with rather an editor's or a copyist's division, perhaps owing to the length of scroll and the convenience of producing it in that fashion. The vast majority of the content of 1st and 2nd Samuel is narrative, and so we'll consider a sampling of narrative devices that we find in these books. Having said that, they contain poetry as well. We'll discuss that in the next slide. One of the features of narrative that's worth watching for has to do with those times when a writer reveals the name of a character and those times when the writer withholds that information. So, for example, in the case of the wise women located at Tekoa and at Avel Beth Ma'akah, we are not given their names, simply the fact that they have this trait of being wise. Evidently, that's the only influence that the writer wants us to extract from their participation in the story. On the other hand, there's a situation when the name of another individual, again a woman, is disclosed. Think of the account of Tamar. Her story, a very tragic story, is in 2 Samuel 13. We know her name and we know her connection because she is the sister of Absalom, and later Absalom will name one of his own daughters for his sister who was disgraced. Other situations where we are given names have to do with the lists of David's various individuals, part of his army, part of his chosen cadre, these mighty men. We know them by name. Another element to consider as we work through narrative is how a given plot in a story is developed. Oftentimes it'll consist of a problem arising, and then as the story unfolds, we discover the resolution of that problem. Consider, for example, Goliath appearing on the scene and issuing these taunts against David's army. And that is resolved as young David appears and courageously engages this champion Goliath, slays him, and then begins a victorious campaign, military campaign, whereas previously the Israelites had been intimidated. Another problem and resolution plot appears in 2 Samuel 21. There's famine in the land, and David, as king, determines he must understand from God why this is taking place. This leads to the discovery of injustice and then resolution of that. So problem and resolution oftentimes typify the plot development within narrative. Do we not have foreshadowing and also reversal when in 2 Samuel 14 we learn that Absalom is gifted with a very rich head of hair? Later on, that head of hair will be his means of being suspended in a tree accidentally, and there he will be exposed to the attack and the execution by his enemies. Another element to be on the lookout for in reading narrative are those times when there seems to be more detail provided than is absolutely necessary to convey the storyline. That struck me as I was reading over 2 Samuel 13, the account of Tamar. Amnon wishes to trap her sexually, and in order to do so, he follows this scheme of asking her to come and cook for him, feigning to be sick. And as we read that story, don't you find that you can actually picture it? The fact that she is there preparing some food, the detail of it is so extensive that we are drawn into imagining and picturing that in our mind. It's a powerful, powerful device, simple, and can go easily undetected. That's part of the sophistication of it. But it seems to be the writer's conscious device to draw us into that story, so that as the pain and wickedness of it unfolds, we will feel more empathetically with the suffering of the victim, and consequently embrace the ethical values of justice that he wants us to recognize and then emulate. While the books of 1 and 2 Samuel are primarily narrative, there are some significant points where poetry breaks through. Consider these. Early in the book, we have a barren wife, and when finally she is able to give birth to a child that will be young Samuel, she responds to God with a statement, a fairly extensive statement of gratitude. This takes the shape of a poem. That's 1 Samuel 2. At the death of Saul and Jonathan, David composes a song of lament. We're even given the name of it. It's known as the Song of the Bow. And we're also given this interesting information that that particular poem, David taught it to the Israelites, and it's recorded in a different document which we do not possess, called the Book of Yashar. Yashar, incidentally, means upright, ethically upright. 2 more poems have been preserved for us coming from David towards the close of his reign. 1 Samuel 22 is a long song recalling God's faithfulness through the course of his monarchy and giving God praise for that. Then the final poem is known as an oracle. It's relatively short, 2 Samuel 23. And as we look at the topics within it, it acknowledges God as the source of rule, but it also remembers with appreciation the fact that God has established David's kingdom as a human rule with an everlasting covenant. That's set in poetry. The last isolated literary device we want to be aware of and acknowledge is the appearance of a parable. A parable. This was employed by the prophet Nathan when he was looking for a way to get David's attention and help him acknowledge that his affair with Bathsheba was terribly wrong. Also, the murder of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah. In that parable, Nathan envisions the situation of a rich man who steals a pet lamb from a poor neighbor and then kills that lamb in order to satisfy his desire to put out a nice meal for a stranger or a guest who has appeared. So the travesty of that transgression against a neighbor, Nathan presents that in parable form. It has the desired effect. David transparently sees the wrongness of that man's deed, and then Nathan unfolds the purpose of the parable and says, you are the one who has committed that misdeed. At this point, I'd like us to engage in an inductive activity that will help us appreciate, I believe, some of the literary composition of the close of 2 Samuel. Focus your attention, please, on chapters 21 to 24, those closing 4 chapters of 2 Samuel. And as you read them over, ask yourself, what are the primary elements? We're looking for large ideas. For example, what is the theme of one of the entire chapters? Not going down to the paragraph or verse level so often, but principally large chapters, maybe a half of a chapter. map out those 4 chapters with an eye to asking what's the main theme or the primary element, not a literary device, but the actual content of it. As you map that out, then look at what you've written down and see if there are any recurring themes. Pause the video at this time and take a few minutes to draft that out. All right, let's pick up again. I wonder if you noticed something like this. The first 14 verses of chapter 21 present us with a famine, and then the resolution of that. 15 through 22 in chapter 21 present us with some valiant acts that selected warriors have carried out on David's behalf. Chapter 22, there's that song of praise. David reflects back over his monarchy and God's faithfulness. The first 7 verses of 23 is where we find another poem, David's last words. So both 22 and the first 7 of 23 are poetry. Then in 23:8, through the balance of that chapter, verse 39, we have a recounting, rather in list form, of David's mighty men. The book concludes by mentioning that there was a plague which broke out when David foolishly pressed ahead against Joab's caution, his general's caution, pressed ahead and conducted a census counting people eligible for conducting battle across Israel. As a result of the way the screen presents the indentation and the enumeration, you're seeing, I expect, this palistrophic structure. A palistrophe is an extended chiastic structure. Chiastic meaning things go in a sequence of 1, 2, 3, and then as you proceed forward, the sequence actually reverses so that the last 3 items will be 3, 2, 1. That sort of inversion is known as a chiasm, or particularly when it's in a more extended passage, such as multiple chapters or even multiple groups of verses, we call this a palistrophe. Just to be sure it's clear, let's observe then that those elements enumerated Arabic number 1 are both situations of problems. A famine is 1, and then 1 prime at the bottom, a plague. 2 and 2 prime give us lists of warriors. And in 3, as we've noticed, both of those are poems. As always, when we observe a literary device, we don't want to stop with simply admiring the sophistry or the skill of the writer. We also want to ask, what would that literary device achieve? What message is it sending? What am I supposed to understand about the content based on the fact that this literary device was employed? Whenever we encounter a palistrophe, we want to be aware that the intent of the writer, what was understood by readers in that environment, in that day and age, was as follows. Principally, we want to be aware that what is in the core, what is right at the hinge point, so in this case, items 3 and 3 prime, those 2 poems, this occupies the pride of place. This is the item most showcased. Here is where the writer wants us to focus our attention, to linger, to really let that message soak in. Consequently, then, of these 4 chapters, the writer most of all hopes that we will exit the reading of these closing chapters impressed by David's acts and words of worship, chapter 22, and David's reaffirmation of God as ruler and the eternal ongoing kingdom that God has promised by covenant to David. Those were the last words. What would seem to be then of next order importance, secondary only to the inner core, would be the outer pieces, the outermost pieces, Arabic numeral 1, encountering the famine and finding what should be done about it, the misfortune of engaging that plague, So the sense of warning, the penalties for abuse of leadership might be elements that we could extract from both of those. In the case of the first one, it was Saul's abuse of leadership and the lingering ill effects of that. In the case of the last one, it was David's own engaging in a public program of census, which he should not have done, and that brings God's judgment. So abuse of power. This seems to be the next most important message from this group of 4 chapters. Notice where that places then the remaining information, items 2 and 2 prime, which are the accounting of military prowess. In this literary scheme, those occupy the least important position. Consider that for a moment. We know that David is famous for militarily overcoming the enemies of Israel, expanding the territory so that it had some of its most extensive geographical expanse, leading up to Solomon's golden age for Israel. However, as the writer exits the account of David's life, he leaves us with a message that the military might of his kingdom is the least important element. It was not insignificant. It had a place, and by the details preserved here, we have a fairly clear picture of who were the individuals that David relied on to bring military skill and success, obviously owing it all to God, but they were humans, they were boots on the ground, and he remembers them. They are given positions of honor, but relative to the importance of acknowledging God as the author of the monarchy's success. See, that's point 3 at the core. That is more important in this relative scheme, this literary scheme. That is given a higher, a more prominent place. And David's last words, honoring God in chapter 23, that's given a higher place even than the contribution of individual warriors. And once again, even the message of caution against abuse of power, that message, and now we're talking about 1 and 1 prime, that message is given a higher place of impact in this closing chapters than the debt owed to humans who were strong and effective soldiers. In the next video, we'll turn our attention to historic observations.